right, thank you. I guess my presentation should appear somewhere, or should I click? Like here? Oh yeah, okay, that works. Okay, great. So thank you for having me here. It's really nice to finally be at an Ethereum conference. I haven't never been at one. And today I would like to share a little bit about my work, which is about both social credit systems and blockchain systems. And I will try to explain to you why I think there is actually some interesting philosophical commonalities between the two. So about myself, so I'm a typical academic. I put some books there. My work spans from, on the one hand, philosophical hermeneutics, to, we wrote a book about blockchain governance, which is focusing on kind of the political and legal philosophy of blockchain. But I'm also doing works on technology ethics, so all kinds of things. And yeah, so and the kind of the two main case studies that have inspired me over the last years, on the one hand, blockchain systems, but on the other hand, something quite completely different. So I've also been very interested in the Chinese effort to build the social credit system. I think that many of you have heard about this system. It was actually the reason why I was asked to do a presentation here. And I thought I can just give you like a nice descriptive overview, but I think it's more interesting now to go into the philosophy of this system. And I think what inspired me to study these two very different phenomena is because I think they're very different, of course. Like it's obvious that blockchain is decentralized, the social credit system is centralized, blockchain is built by private actors, the social credit system is state-driven. There's lots of differences, but I think there is also something that they have in common. And you could say that both technologies try to grapple with the question of trust. That is maybe the obvious answer. And they give different answers to this question of trust. And underlying this, I think, lies a very interesting philosophical theme that has been quite central to the history of political thought, which is the notion of civic virtue. I think these days we often associate virtue with virtue signaling, like it's often called into the media as like, there's the so-called woke mind virus. There's all this discourse about people using or like being corrupted in terms of virtue, but I think this is kind of a distraction, largely, because while this discourse is going on, it's my understanding that actually we are in the middle of a transformation of civic virtue, not through kind of superficial rhetorics, but rather through the implementation of large-scale digital systems. And here, this is actually where I think both social credit system and blockchain systems kind of intersect, and I will try to explain to you why. So let's go back all the way to Aristotle to start, with this notion of the ship of state. You probably heard it before. There's American politicians who mention it. But it also actually tells us something very fundamental about political thinking. So for Aristotle in the politics, political philosophy is really about trying to understand the relationship between citizens and the state. And in the politics, he draws an analogy with a ship. So he says, well, a state is something like a ship. So you have like a Greek trireme and a crew, and every crew member has their own qualities and dispositions. But at the same time, they need to have an aim in common. They have to have a common telos. And this telos, for example, if you're in a ship, is safety and coordination while navigating the seas. And this is actually Aristotle's way to introduce the topic of civic virtue, because civic virtue are those dispositions that citizens have that mediate between their individual existence and the aims of the political community. So that's why it's a very fundamental concept, at least in Aristotelian political philosophy, that I think we have to go back to. I will skip this because it's a bit too long. But okay, so I think civic virtue is the underlying theme that connects the social credit system and blockchain technology. And let me start with the one side of the picture, so the social credit system. And I think we have to understand the emergence of the social credit system not just in its recent iteration, but we have to understand it against a longer historical background. And this longer historical background also shows that actually the system is not necessarily just a Chinese system. It actually it shows us kind of a mirror, because we have a lot of similar type of technologies in our societies as well. And here, this is like an interesting example. So in our historical research, we found this peculiar book by Cynthia Brakov about an entrepreneur in 16th century China called Yuan Huang. And he was a kind of a entrepreneurial figure. And what he did was he made his own business basically by promoting the use of moral self-help books among the elites in China. This was quite a big phenomenon. So in the course of like a few decades, suddenly a lot of people in the Chinese elite were using diaries or like kind of moral bookkeeping books where they would keep track of their good deeds and their bad deeds, and they would quantify them. And the idea here was that it has like a religious connotation. You might also think like in Western Europe we had in the Middle Ages we had confession and a kind of treasury of merits. So this is an interesting parallel there. And the idea is that if you quantify your good deeds and your bad deeds, you have some kind of cosmic benefit of that. So you can get some luck by actually doing this type of moral bookkeeping. So like an early form of virtue signaling, so to say. But of course, the underlying idea is that it actually is about civic virtue. It's about those dispositions that should give you a good standing in society. Okay, then we skip a few years, and then we go to this figure. This is, you might know him, he's Qian Shuzhen, very interesting. He's like a hero in China, but a lot of people in the West don't really know about him. But he worked on the Manhattan Project in the Second World War. So first his career was actually in the US, but then in the Red Scare they thought he was a spy, so he fled to China basically, and he became one of the main figures under the communist regime who were like behind the Chinese rocket science program and the nuclear program. But that was not his only feat. The other feat was that he was also using cybernetics to do social engineering. And this has also had a profound impact on Chinese policy making. I mean, like the one-child policy, for example, in China is in part the result of also the implementation of cybernetic modeling. So what he promoted was this idea that we have to look at society from a kind of cybernetic point of view, it being something what he called like an open, complex, giant open, complex system, where it's all about trying to make kind of qualitative dispositions and wishes and needs of citizens quantifiable in order to have machines that could interpret those dispositions and build some kind of governance system. And this lies very much behind also the thinking of the design of the social credit system. So the people who are instrumental to its coming into being were very much inspired by the school of Qian Shuzhen, and also because this was kind of the only type of science that survived the Cultural Revolution. Because we often think that all the sciences were kind of crushed in the Cultural Revolution, but actually this branch survived. And after the reforming opening up, or during the reforming opening up era, it became a very important branch. Okay, then let's go to the social credit system. So the social credit system actually was conceived of in the 1990s because of, this is like the Gilded Age also in China, so there was a lot of economic growth, but at the same time there was a lot of corruption. So in the beginning, the idea was we need some kind of way to build trust in society to make like trustworthy business transactions. We can look at the United States. In the United States, we have like things like FICO and like FICO scores, like ways of credit rating, credit scoring, in order to build some kind of trust. But interestingly, this early initiative is taking up in the larger ideological kind of setting, in which there is this notion of rule by virtue. So the idea is that the state is not only trying to build these more low-level kind of credit worthiness, but at the same time it also wants to do some kind of moral education. It's about bringing citizens up with regard to their level of virtue. And how does it do this? I think there's often like a misconception that we think that's kind of some Instagram-like scoring system where there's like a super score and everybody is affected by that, but actually it's like more of an umbrella of different policies. The most important national policies is that there's a centralized database with credit information that is linked to black lists for sanctions and red lists for rewards. And next to that, there are so-called model cities. So the central government is incentivizing local governments to experiment with social credit systems. So there you also have like the typical point systems. You know, you get 1,000 points and you can lose some if you do something bad. If you do something good, you can gain some. And there's a coordination of commercial rating agencies. So maybe you have heard of like Sesame Credit. That comes out of the initiative to incentivize big tech corporations to build like alternative credit scoring mechanisms, which now are actually consolidated. So now there is a national consolidation effort where there's a national institution, Baihang Credit, which is now the primary rating institution that is governed by the Chinese state. So it's kind of being centralized again. So why is this such an interesting case, I think? It's not because of its effectiveness per se, because its effectiveness is very dubious. It's not so clear whether this is actually a very good idea. Because on the one hand, it does give you a stronger sense of control. On the other hand, it also creates a huge administrative burden. And whether this is good or not, we have to see. But I think it's so interesting because it's of its scope. Because it makes something explicit that I think is happening all over the world, which is that the scope is citizenship. It's not just financial credit in a very narrow sense. No, it's really about building good citizens. It's about exactly this Aristotelian idea of fostering this relationship between the citizen and the state in accordance with virtue. That's exactly what it's about. So we can use political philosophy to think about this a bit more. Here's the late Alistair MacIntyre, who just died like a week ago, I think, unfortunately. But he's like a major figure in like the revival of virtue ethics, and he says that, well, he has an interesting way of approaching this question of moral excellence. So he says, virtue basically are those dispositions that realize internal goods in practices. That sounds a little bit like complex perhaps, but you can relate it, for example, to a pianist playing a beautiful piano piece or a concerto. The idea here is that the goods that practice brings forth, so to say, are not external to that practice. So they emanate from the practice itself. It's not like that he plays so nicely piano because he gets paid for it or because he has a great reputation. No, it's actually the very practice that stimulates those internal goods. So that's like the way in which we can distinguish virtue from other types of dispositions. And he says that, well, actually, and we know about this because we have certain delivered standards of excellence that inform our practices, that are embedded in some kind of like narrative that we call tradition. So because we have these like long-standing practices with their standards of excellence, we can actually say something about virtue beyond the particular moment. So in a way, you could say like, well, actually, social credit is trying to do kind of this, you know? I mean, it's like trying to capture these standards of excellence in order to bring out moral excellence in the citizenry. But at the same time, we can use also MacIntyre's philosophical system to critique what's going on here, because the whole point of the social credit system is that all the leverage or all the process by means of which people cultivate their virtues is through incentives, or you could say through carrots and sticks. You know, so the reason why you would do something is not because there's some kind of intrinsic worth in that particular practice, but because you can gain a certain reputation, or not be shamed, or because you can gain certain resources, sometimes political resources. So, and there's like an interesting literature also in social psychology about like how external goods can actually crowd out these kind of internal motivations. So you could say then actually these standards of excellence that are formulated by something like the social credit system are corrupting rather than supporting virtue in this MacIntyrean sense, creating some kind of a pathology of civic virtue, like some form of conformism, rather than people pursuing like good deeds out of their own intrinsic motivation. And this is, of course, something that has been a theme in liberalism for a long time. So here's John Rawls. One of the things is that liberals are generally very skeptical about virtue in the first place, because virtue implies some idea of the good life. It's like, you know, we want to say this is the good life and want to impose it on everybody, you know. And liberals are very suspicious of that for good reasons, because we live in a society of plurality. So everybody has their own conception of the good, and we cannot impose a particular conception of the good on the general populace. So that's why John Rawls, for example, says, like, a just society is a society that draws boundaries around spontaneous action rather than a society that shows the point, he says, so a society that actually imposes the good on our behaviors. Which is, of course, a nice ideal, but this is also liberal societies. This is JP Morgan. So if we look back into history, at the early credit reporting mechanisms that emerged in the United States after the Gilded, or in the course of the Gilded Age in the US, credit reporting was an extremely sophisticated and very huge surveillance industry, with where very intimate details about people were actually being gathered, like intimate details about even like their marital status, whether they were honest businessmen, those kind of things. They were all like collected by credit bureaus. And in the early 20th century, there was a hearing by the US Congress about this, and they asked JP Morgan about, like, so this whole credit rate reporting business, isn't this all about money? Isn't this all about whether somebody can pay their bills? And he said, no, the first thing is character. The first thing is virtue. It's actually something that we cannot buy as bankers, but we want to try to grapple with. And one of the people at these credit bureaus also said, like, well, credit reporting is something like, has the moral force that only is surpassed by the church. So this, you know, even in liberal societies, we have these like surveillance-like institutions that also promote a form of civic virtue, but at the expense of liberal principles, one could say. And why is this the case? Why is this a dilemma that also liberals have to deal with? It's because people can cheat. You know, there's like the confidence man, Hammer Melville, where I think one of the themes is that confidence is actually something, so confidence, civility, is built through common institutions in society, like through like a common language, a common currency. But at the same time, this kind of scaling of society in modern times also creates a hidden vice. So the confidence man exactly embodies this vice. The person who can cheat his way through the commonalities that we all have. So in order to counter this vice, we have to grapple with reputation of people's character. So we have to have some kind of knowledge about virtues, let's say. But the problem is, and that's also interesting, because the book of the confidence man was based on an actual story of a guy in New York who was swindling people to get their wallet, to get their watches, the golden watches. And somebody in the newspaper wrote about it and said, like, well, this is great that we got this guy, but the real confidence man, they actually live on Wall Street. So it's like an early critique that very much resonates with Satoshi Nakamoto's paper, basically. You know, like, actually, the problem is all the way up there, like where we have the confidence man. So in a way, like on the surface level, you could say, like, well, blockchain is actually like a perfect answer to this difficult dilemma of trust. Tackling this implicit problem of vice that you have, and offering kind of a liberal solution to this problem, like structure without agency. So there's like the Rawlsian idea. You know, you have a boundary. You set like a digital boundary within which spontaneous action can occur. You could say, like, so in a way, this brings out a very thin sense of civic virtue in those people who are interacting through a blockchain. And in one of our papers, and what you also do in the book, we talk about this as characterizing blockchain not as a trustless technology, but as a confidence machine. And we say this because in the English language, there's this interesting distinction between trust and confidence that is leveraged by Luhmann, the sociologist, where he says that, well, trust is this very personal attitude where we can address ourselves towards somebody. You can be betrayed, you put yourselves into a position of vulnerability, and you take some active risks. Confidence is actually not like that. Confidence is built by systems, and it is generated through structural predictability rather than through like somebody that you trust and that you can address. So there's nobody you can address. Like similarly with the blockchain, there's nobody you can actually address, And if something goes wrong, it's not a betrayal, it's kind of a bug, or it's like a failure, or like we call it differently, basically. So you could say like this is indeed a confidence machine, but interestingly, I think, the history of blockchain so far shows really clearly that confidence man still persists, like not in little degrees. There's a lot of very interesting cases where there's a lot of swindling going on. And the same with states of exception, but that's a different topic. And this, I think a related interesting thing about this is that whereas I think the initial ideology behind blockchain is very much liberal in the sense of like focusing on free speech and personal freedoms, property rights, there's also like a really strong sense of dogmatism, like more and more, I think, where you have communities that are increasingly find it increasingly difficult to talk with each other, because even though we believe in these kind of liberal principles, at the same time, we think that, you know, only my chain is right, or like there's only like one dogma that is the right one. And I think that is the reason for this is like similar to like the distinction between like virtue signaling and this like underlying transformation of virtue by means of digital technology, is that actually dogma is placed at the level of rhetorics, but under that there's actually like a vast territory of vested practices and dispositions that we have to look at, that actually explains why there is this dogma, the dogmatism, I think. That's a little bit of a side note, but going back to the need then for reputation, I think that's still, you know, so the thing with even blockchain systems is like, even though it's a confidence machine, you cannot completely outrule trust in the thickest sense. So we still, you could say like trust is actually another word for civic virtue. So we need mechanisms as well to build a certain type of civility, to trust each other more than just in a very thin sense because the infrastructure is predictable. And there are some interesting cases where people are thinking about like zero-knowledge reputation management systems, and I think that those are actually quite important to pursue. And in order to understand what type of civic virtue that we actually get if we do that, we can think of a different type of political philosophy. So this is Philip Pettit. He is representing the New Republican school of thought. And he talks in his book, so his thought is all about like how can we build a republic that promotes freedom as non-domination. And in order to do that, he says there is actually something very crucial that you need to cultivate in society, which he calls civility. And civility, according to Pettit, is this sense of beneficence that we have towards one another because we implicitly always interact with each other in a form of reputational game. So whenever we interact, there is always a tit-for-tat reputational game, and that builds into a history, and that's why, as a community, we can live together. And I think that this is exactly the thing that things like zero-knowledge reputation management systems try to replicate in the digital realm, which is good. But at the same time, I think we have to be careful as well, because what Pettit says is like this way, or this like process by which civility is cultivated happens, first of all, decentrally, and also non-intentionally. So whenever we interact, like we build reputation, but we don't mean to. It's like, you know, we have a nice conversation, you build a reputation, but not because you're actually actively pursuing to be reputable, so to say. And this is actually an important thing, because once that is done differently, there is what he calls, there is this threat of domination, and I think that also is something that in blockchain systems you have to be really, really critical about, because this is a threat that is not easily circumvented, I think. Because we could say like, okay, well, blockchain of course is decentralized, but I put here like Alexis de Tocqueville, because we have to think about decentralization in different aspects. Like, for example, he talks about the United States in the time that he visited, this like young democracy, and he said like, well, this is actually a perfect example of political decentralization. You have all these townships, that's actually where the power lies. The federal government is very powerless, basically. So it's a very decentralized system of governance. But at the same time, he said like, well, America is maybe the most centralized state in the world. How can that be? How can these two things interrelate? because he makes a distinction between political and administrative centralization. He says, like, administrative centralization has nothing to do with having a centralized power that administrates. It has to do with standards and with common language. It has to do with standardizing, for example, those measures of merit, or standardizing those measures of virtue in that sense. So, and that's, I think, the type of centralization that is hard to circumvent in blockchain systems. So that's something that we have to really think about really deeply. And at the same time, also, like, this non-intentional aspect is really hard not to implement digitally, because especially because you don't know each other, often, like on sharing platforms or elsewhere, reputation is built very intentionally. Like, whenever we give each other like a star rating or a comment or something, that's exactly an intentional form of reputation building. So there are some threats here, and I think that's important to look at. Just to finish, I think I'm almost out of time. So to wrap up, I think civic virtue is a theme that surprisingly connects the social credit system and blockchain systems. And what I think we need to think about when we attack these threats that I just talked about, like these problems that might arise, is that eventually, if this is a political system, we need some form of a public sphere, because the public sphere is that place or that configuration, if you follow, for example, Hannah Arendt, in which we can act and speak in concert and realize our political freedom, basically. And there are certain initiatives. So I think, for example, the plurality book is a really good way to address this. Even though I'm also critical about these initiatives, but I think that these type of initiatives deserve a lot of attention from us, because that's where eventually we can make a difference between building a political community through blockchain technology that is actually conducive of virtue rather than one that is detrimental to it. All right. That's a long talk. So I hope you enjoyed it, and thank you for your attention. And I think I have time maybe for one question or two. I don't know, like, it's very little, but thank you. Only one. Or if there's no question, I'm also happy to just talk with you in a break. Great. Then I think thank you again, and I'm looking forward to the other speakers. So thanks.